Chapter 4 of Mary, Queen of Scots. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carol Stripling. Mary, Queen of Scots by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 4. Misfortunes. It was said in the last chapter that Mary loved her husband, infirm and feeble as he was, both in body and in mind. This love was probably the effect, quite as much as it was the cause, of the kindness which she showed him. As we are very apt to hate those whom we have injured, so we almost instinctively love those who have in any way become the objects of our kindness and care. If any wife, therefore, wishes for the pleasure of loving her husband, or which is perhaps a better supposition, if any husband desires the happiness of loving his wife, conscious that it is a pleasure which he does not now enjoy, let him commence by making her the object of his kind attentions and care, and love will spring up in the heart as a consequence of the kind of action of which it is more commonly the cause. About a year passed away, when at length another great celebration took place in Paris to honor the marriages of some other members of King Henry's family. One of them was Francis's oldest sister. A grand tournament was arranged on this occasion too. The place for this tournament was where the great street of Saint Antoine now lies, and which may be found on any map of Paris. A very large concourse of kings and nobles from all the courts of Europe were present. King Henry, magnificently dressed and mounted on a superb war-horse, was a very prominent figure in all the parades of the occasion, though the actual contests and trials of skill which took place were between younger princes and knights, King Henry and the ladies being generally only spectators and judges. He, however, took a part himself on one or two occasions, and received great applause. At last, at the end of the third day, just as the tournament was to be closed, King Henry was riding around the field, greatly excited with the pride and pleasure which so magnificent a spectacle was calculated to awaken, when he saw 2 lances still remaining which had not been broken. The idea immediately seized him of making one more exhibition of his own power and dexterity in such contests. He took one of the lances, and directing a high officer who was riding near him to take the other, he challenged him to a trial of skill. The name of this officer was Montgomery. Montgomery at first declined, being unwilling to contend with his king. The king insisted. Queen Catherine begged that he would not contend again. Accidents sometimes happened, she knew, in these rough encounters, and at any rate it terrified her to see her husband exposed to such dangers. The other lords and ladies, and Francis and Queen Mary particularly, joined in these expostulations. But Henry was inflexible. There was no danger, and smiling at their fears, he commanded Montgomery to arm himself with his lance and take his position. The spectators looked on in breathless silence. The 2 horsemen rode toward each other, each pressing his horse forward to his utmost speed, and as they passed, each aimed his lance at the head and breast of the other. It was customary on such occasions to wear a helmet with a part called a visor in front, which could be raised on ordinary occasions, or let down in moments of danger like this to cover and protect the eyes. Of course, this part of the armor was weaker than the rest, and it happened that Montgomery's lance struck here, was shivered, and a splinter of it penetrated the visor and inflicted a wound upon Henry on the head just over the eye. Henry's horse went on. The spectators observed that the rider reeled and trembled in his seat. The whole assembly were in consternation. The excitement of pride and pleasure was everywhere turned into extreme anxiety and alarm. They flocked about Henry's horse and helped the king to dismount. He said it was nothing. They took off his helmet and found large drops of blood issuing from the wound. They bore him to his palace. He had the magnanimity to say that Montgomery must not be blamed for this result, as he was himself responsible for it entirely. He lingered 11 days and then died. This was in July 1559. One of the marriages which this unfortunate tournament had been intended to celebrate, that of Elizabeth, the king's daughter, had already taken place, having been performed a day or two before the king was wounded, and it was decided, after Henry was wounded, that the other must proceed, as there were great reasons of state against any postponement of it. This second marriage was that of Margaret, his sister. The ceremony in her case was performed in a silent and private manner, at night, by torchlight, in the chapel of the palace, while her father was dying. The services were interrupted by her sobs and tears. Notwithstanding the mental and bodily feebleness which seemed to characterize the Dauphin, Mary's husband, who now, by the death of his father, became King of France, the event of his accession to the throne seemed to awaken his energies and arouse him to animation and effort. He was sick himself and in his bed in a palace called the Tournelles, when some officers of state were ushered into his apartment and, kneeling before him, saluted him as king. This was the first announcement of his father's death. He sprang from his bed, exclaiming at once that he was well. It is one of the sad consequences of hereditary greatness and power that a son must sometimes rejoice at the death of his father. It was Francis's duty to repair at once to the royal palace of the Louvre with Mary, who was now Queen of France as well as of Scotland, to receive the homage of the various estates of the realm. Catherine was, of course, now Queen Dowager. Mary, the child whom she had so long looked upon with feelings of jealousy and envy, was, from this time, to take her place as queen. It was very humiliating to Catherine to assume the position of a second and an inferior in the presence of one whom she had so long been accustomed to direct and to command. She yielded, however, with a good grace, though she seemed dejected and sad. As they were leaving the Tournelles, she stopped to let Mary go before her, saying, "Pass on, madame. It is your turn to take precedence now." Mary went before her, but she stopped in her turn, with a sweetness of disposition so characteristic of her, to let Queen Catherine enter first into the carriage which awaited them at the door. Francis, though only 16, was entitled to assume the government himself. He went to Rheims, a town northeast of Paris, where is an abbey, which is the ancient place of coronation for the kings of France. Here he was crowned. He appointed his ministers, and evinced in his management and in his measures more energy and decision than it was supposed he possessed. He himself and Mary were now together on the summit of earthly grandeur. They had many political troubles and cares which cannot be related here, but Mary's life was comparatively peaceful and happy, the pleasures which she enjoyed being greatly enhanced by the mutual affection which existed between herself and her husband. Though he was small in stature and very unprepossessing in appearance and manners, Francis still evinced in his government a considerable degree of good judgment and of energy. His health, however, gradually declined. He spent much of his time in travelling, and was often dejected and depressed. One circumstance made him feel very unhappy. The people of many of the villages through which he passed, being in those days very ignorant and superstitious, got a rumour into circulation that the king's malady was such that he could only be cured by being bathed in the blood of young children. They imagined that he was travelling to obtain such a bath, and were